Do you wonder where the name Racette came from? Or who started our family tree? I'm Charlotte Kulla, the second child and daughter of Thomas Eugene Racette and Anna Tallmeyer Racette, and my husband is Robert Paul Kulla from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I had those same questions. My research found some interesting family history, which I hope you'll enjoy. Welcome to our Racette Ancestry story. A couple notes first. It's abundantly clear from European culture and history that ancestry lineage is a male-dominated search, since mostly sons carry on a family name. So forgive me, fellow females, if you feel slighted. Also noteworthy is in searching for the name Racette, I found different spellings over time, no doubt due to the listening language and spelling skills of those in charge of recording data. The first time Racette is spelled as we spell it today is on Joseph Racette's marriage license in 1880. It would not be until the 1900s when the spelling becomes consistent. Last, even though I don't mention this often in our story, it is noteworthy that our ancestors were, and many of us today still are, Catholics. For researchers, this is a blessing because the Catholic Church has kept meticulous records of all births, marriages, and deaths, which are like treasure chests when tracing family ties. Okay, with those underlying understandings taken care of, let's begin our Racette family story. Our story traces to the 1600s, which was an age of feudalism when a king, royalty, and Catholic churches owned all land and collected taxes from the people or peasants who worked their land. The name Racette takes us to a heavily wooded area and rural town called Sainte-Geneviève-en-Brie in Rouen, France. On July 11, 1643, a devout Catholic couple named Pierre Racette and Jeanne Duthaye gave birth to their fifth child, whom they named Jean Racette. Baby Jean joined a family that already had 2 girls and 2 boys. In the 1600s, life in France was difficult. People were poor, the government taxed everyone heavily, rents were high, and a drought devastated crops. Jean, who was 20 years old and the youngest son, must have had little hope of inheriting anything from his poor parents. So it stands to reason that when he heard French King Louis XIV call for citizens to settle New France in a new land across the Atlantic Ocean, he saw an opportunity. After all, he was young and strong, only 20 years old, and had learned the family skills of a sawyer and as carpenter. In short, off to New France he would sail. While no document has ever been found to confirm the exact date of Jean Racette's passage to New France, or what we call Quebec, Canada, the year 1664 seems most likely because in the 1665 census in Beauport, Jean Racette is listed as a carpenter and hired hand. Of 8 ships that made the Atlantic crossing in 1664, only 5 made it to Quebec, Canada. The one that most likely transported Jean is the Saint Jean Baptiste based in Rouen. That ship left the port of Dieppe, which was closest to his birthplace. The ship carried about 100 hands like Jean, and girls and women whom King Louis XIV sent to marry and have children with male settlers to build New France's population. In earlier times, people's last name described what they did. In France, Jean's family were woodcutters and carpenters, hence the name Racette. Jean is credited with having brought the name Racette to North America. For at least 8 years, Jean worked for landowners, clearing land and doing carpentry. With the money he earned and saved, in the 1670s, he bought land which would become Saint Augustin de Demour. Less than 200 people lived in the area during Jean's life. Today, approximately 17,000 people live there, and it is a suburb of Quebec City. Bob and I visited the Racette family farm in August 2023. Family Racette lives next to the St. Lawrence River and extends west to the little white building at the top of the picture. While in the 1600s, farmers complained about the St. Lawrence River being a hindrance because they could not extend their farms south, today that river property is of premium value. At the age of 35, Jean married 21-year-old Jeanne Chapeau, a daughter of parents who were earlier settlers of Quebec. They gave birth to and raised 16 children, worked a productive farm, and still managed to live long lives. This sign is on Route 138 that runs through Saint Augustin de Demour. Route Racette leads from town down a hill to Jean and Jeanne Racette's farm. In September 1999, our Canadian Racette relatives installed a plaque on the property of Jean's birthplace in France, showing appreciation for his travel to the New World and for beginning the Racette family from which we all have descended. The two top corner fleur-de-lis represent Jean's origin from France and then settling in what is today the French-speaking Canadian province, Quebec, or what was then New France. The bottom symbols represent the two countries where his descendants have carried his last name. On the left is the Canadian oak leaf, and on the right is the U.S. star. This graphic depicts Jean and Jeanne's family. The green highlighting helps us to follow the male offspring of Jean that leads us to you and me today. The next chapter in our story is about their son, Francois Racette. 4 years after Jean died, his wife Jeanne offered the farm to her oldest children still in the area. When they gave up their rights to the farm, she gave it to her 24-year-old son, Francois, on the condition that he give her shelter, food, clothing, and care for the rest of her life. That farm then was valued in today's dollars at about $409,000. Before leaving this photo, do you notice the posts on the left side of the Racette barn? We were told that they are the original tree trunks used in building the barn. Each tree trunk cost the Racettes 10 cents apiece at the time. After working the farm as the owner for 10 years, Francois, at 35 years old, finally found time to fall in love and marry. In 1725, he married 21-year-old Marguerite Jobin. She would give birth to 8 children during 11 years of marriage, then die young at 32 years old. It is Francois and her 4th son, Jean-Charles Racette, who would be our next direct ancestor. With its first wife gone, yet still having a farm to run and a house full of children to raise, a year later, Francois married again. His second wife was Marguerite Coiteau. Together they had 6 more children. All total, Francois would father 14 children before he passed away at age 68. Coincidentally, the same age his father Jean was when he died. but it's Francois' son with his first wife who is our direct ancestor. It is Jean Charles who is important to our story because he's our direct ancestor and he inherited the farm, keeping it in the Racette family. As we can see from the chart, Jean Charles and Marie named their first son Jean Charles after his father. As you'll find, trying to keep these men named Charles straight in your head can be trying. And having come from a family with 3 generations of Tom, I can sympathize with these families. Like so many women in those days, Jean Charles' wife, or son Charles' mother, Marie Anne, died when she was 34 years old. 4 years later, after her death, her husband Jean Charles, who had Charles and other young children to raise, was himself only 38 years old and would remarry. Notice too that this chart shows how church records spell Racette, R-A-S-S-E-T, now as Racette, R-A-C-E-T. Stay tuned, the spelling continues to evolve. Jean Charles' second wife was Marie Félicité Gingras. They would expand the family with 7 more children. These children would create a different Racette branch than ours, making them our step or half cousins. At 50 years old, Marie died. Charles would live another 25 years, dying at age 85. What's important about this second marriage is that their third son, Francois, would end up inheriting the Racette family farm that exists today. We're going to take a quick detour from our ancestral story so you can meet our Racette step cousin. Laurent Racette is the 10th generation and current owner of the Racette farm. He is seen here with his wife Teresa and their nephew Marc-Antoine. Laurent and Teresa have both a son and grandson who plan to keep and work the farm. It's remarkable to think that the Racette farm not only has continued since 1675, but also has remained a property of the Racettes. Lauren proudly drove Bob and me around the St. Augustine de Demour town, pointing out numerous other properties owned by Racettes. It's all quite amazing. Okay, back to our Racette branch. This next family is a bit of an anomaly, but ends up influencing and spicing up our ancestral story a lot. Remember that Charles is the first son of 7 siblings. He would grow up and at 38 years old, marry Marguerite Poyer, who was 28. Unfortunately, Charles and Marguerite miscarry their first child, but a year later are blessed with what would be their only child, and fortunately for us, a son, or else our Racette branch would have been severed at this point. Poignant, isn't it? Little is known about this couple other than they named their only living child Charles Augustin Racette. At 61 years old, the father Charles died even before his own father. His wife Marguerite would live until the winter of 1842, passing away at the age of 82. As an adult, Charles Guston served as an enlisted soldier in the U.S. Army from 1814 to 1818. This was a period when the U.S. allied with France to protect Quebec territory from the English, who wanted it and who were allied with First Nations tribes. Although blurry in this slide, his military record raises several questions, such as why did he serve in the U.S. Army instead of the Canadian or Quebec? And why was his surname written down 3 times, each with a different spelling? Did he keep changing the spelling himself each time he reported for duty? Or was the recorder so unsure that he simply decided to cover all possibilities of what Charles was saying? Yet another question relates to Charles being described as present sick and then discharged for inability. Did his sickness relate to him not being able to serve? Was Charles generally a physically unwell man, or was it coincidental timing? Or perhaps did he have a chronic physical or mental ailment? 2 years into his short military enlistment, 20-year-old Charles married 17-year-old Esther, and together they had 7 children. Perhaps an answer to Charles' physical condition would be answered 22 years later, when at the age of 43, Charles Augustine died as described in this church record. Today, the 29th of March, 1838, interred in the cemetery of this parish by we, the undersigned priests, was the body of Charles Racette, age 43 years, farmer in the region, who died yesterday morning of drunkenness, as sworn by the undersigned witnesses. Sadly, there is no mention of funeral or Esther even knowing, let alone being present for the burial. As unfortunate as Charles's death was, it turns out to be very important in our history. For one, his wife Esther, who was left a widow with several children to raise, remarried. Her second husband was Oliver Peacock. Oliver Peacock and his wife Esther, along with all the Racette children, moved across the border into the United States with what can only be assumed were hopes of improving their lives. Most importantly for us, Esther, and particularly her son Narcisse, our direct ancestor, brought the Racette surname to the United States, where they would remain. Their first stop is in Elizabethtown, New York. In 1865, the U.S. Federal Census shows Narcisse as Nelson Racette, married to Amelia Roy since 1850, and he worked as a collier in Elizabethtown, New York. They had 6 children between the ages 1.5 to 11 years old. Besides having Americanized his name from Narcisse to Nelson, 3 years later, this record shows Nelson became a naturalized U.S. citizen, the first U.S. citizen who was born in Canada on our Racette ancestry tree. In that same year, 1868, he acquired land in the Elizabethtown area. 7 years later, the 1875 federal census identifies Nelson as a farmer, supporting his mother Esther, his wife, and their now 9 children. His firstborn son, Joseph, was already 21 years old and is listed as a farm laborer, perhaps on his father's farm. To close Nelson's mother Esther's chapter, in 1895, she passed away at the extraordinary age of 95 years old, 1 month from turning 96. In our ancestry tree, she would win the prize for longevity. Apparently, farming did not turn out well for Nelson because in 1880, he and his family are listed in a U.S. Census as living in an apartment building or a multi-family house at 129 Adams Street in Lowell, Massachusetts. From this 1880 census record, we learn that in Lowell, Massachusetts, Nelson worked as a laborer while his wife Amelia kept house. Of their 12 children, 9 are listed as living with them in Lowell, and 2 of them, including the oldest son Joseph, were already married and living with Nelson and Amelia. To look at the census data of the Nelson Racette family is to get a glimpse into the industrial age and have it come alive. Every child in Nelson's family, female and male, from ages 10 and above, worked in either a paper mill or a cotton mill. It's so astonishing to read that their 10, 12, and 14-year-old children are working in mills. Life must have been difficult because according to the Massachusetts 1852 law, all children between 8 and 14 were required to attend school for at least 3 months each year. For whatever reason, only Nelson's 8-year-old child is listed as being in school. Perhaps the other kids attended school during 3 months when the census person was not recording the data? We don't know. Their youngest children, ages 6 and 4, are listed as being still at home. 9 children appear in the 1880 census, yet this chart shows 12 children being born. I wonder if Frederick, John, and Nora died during or after birth or shortly thereafter, because their death dates are unknown. The death records of Nelson and Amelia Racette show them buried in different states. Amelia died at 58 in 1891, and her grave marker is in the Catholic St. Joseph and St. John Cemetery in Ishpeming, Michigan. Yet Nelson is listed in a New York state index as having died 7 years later at the age of 70 in the year 1898. Their separation certainly makes one wonder if they chose to be separated or if health or financial circumstances forced them to make choices that separated them. Joseph Racette, at 21 years old, had worked as a farm laborer in Elizabethtown, New York, then as a paper mill worker in Lowell, Massachusetts. According to my Aunt Sandy, that is Sandra Racette Roberts, Joseph, her grandfather, went to Quebec, Canada on business for the paper mill and became ill, ending up in a hospital. Working there was Marie Gervais, a French-speaking Quebec native. The patient and hospital worker fell in love. Joseph is 25 years old and Marie at 20, married on January 4th, 1880. The warm clothes that they're wearing in this wedding photo certainly reflect a winter day. Aunt Sandy recalls a couple interesting stories about Marie, or Mary as she would go by. One is after Mary's parents and family moved to Massachusetts, Mary's sister, a very colorful, theatrical individual, one day told her family that she was going west to pursue her dreams of becoming an actress. Her parents were furious. When some days later, Mary found a dress of her sister's and decided to wear it, her parents forbade her to wear the dress and for her to become a hussy like her sister. Probably out of fear that they would lose another child, her parents sent Mary back to Quebec to live with relatives. It certainly would explain why Mary would be in Quebec when Joseph met her. Adding another layer to Mary's life is Aunt Sandy's remembering her mother having inherited two photo books, a red and a blue album, from her mother-in-law, Mary. While it's from within the blue album that this and other photos were found, Aunt Sandy's mother, Alice, would not allow anyone to look at the red album photos, and that album appears to no longer exist. Apparently, the album contained Mary's first marriage to a First Nations man, or as Sandy's mother said, an Indian brave. With that husband, Marie was said to have had 3 girls, but lost her entire family, her husband and 3 children, when vandals set fire to their house and help couldn't get to them soon enough. Given tensions that existed between Quebec citizens and First Nations citizens who allied with the English soldiers to take control of New France, such a violent incident is entirely plausible. Between 1880 and 1900, Joseph and Mary moved their family from Massachusetts to Iron Mountain in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there was a demand for workers in mines and lumbering. While their travel route is not known, even today the trip would be a long one. By 1900, the couple lived at 725 D Street in Iron Mountain, a house that they would live in until their last years of life. In the 1900 census, Joseph's work is listed as fire station. However, 2 years later, on his son Eugene's birth certificate, his occupation changed to miner. My father left a note saying that his grandfather Joseph worked as a boiler attendant in a coal mine. Certainly jobs would have been limited for Joseph because he could not read or write, but could speak English, whereas his wife Mary could read, write, and speak in French, but could not read, write, or speak English. Their son Eugene, my grandfather, often shared how only French was spoken in their home. The kids learned English in school and from others outside the house. I'm guessing that this might have been the last family photo taken in Lowell, Massachusetts, before Joseph and family moved to Iron Mountain, Michigan. My grandfather Eugene is not in the picture, which would make sense since he wasn't born until 1902. An interesting detail in my father's notes about this picture is that Joseph was supposed to have had an artificial eye since age 4. Eugene, on the left, is the grandfather for many of us. He would tell us how strict his father was. Joseph does look stern and always so grouchy in every picture. And his insistence on the boys working outside the home at a young age, an attitude that he probably learned from his father, Nelson. Remember how the 10 to 14-year-olds were working in mills? My grandfather used to tell us how my grandfather's last year of school was 4th grade. Aunt Sandy remembers him saying 7th grade, and how he chopped wood and sawed wood for money to supplement the family's income. The youngest son, George, was cognitively challenged, but census data shows that while he lived with his parents until they died, he supported himself working as a laborer in a woodworking plant, as well as made and sold wood carvings. To show me the car in the background and the relative youthfulness still of the parents in relation to their ages at death, I'm guessing this photo is from the mid to late 1920s. 1920 census data tell us that at 65 years old, Joseph worked as a laborer in a sawmill working on his own account. meaning that he was neither salaried nor waged employee. So I'm guessing that means he worked as needed by his employer or by his family. A decade later, when Joseph was 76, he still worked. Then he was a church janitor, and he, Mary, and George still lived at 725 East D Street in Iron Mountain, Michigan. This photo appeared in a Milwaukee newspaper in 1938. Marie was 79 years old and living with her daughter Ella Racette Hebert and her family at 4114 West Fairmont, Milwaukee. It's a timely memento because Marie died later that year. An aside, note how male-dominated the world still is in 1938. In the caption, none of the women appear to have their own first names. They're all referred to by their husbands' names, first and last. Living with their daughter Ella until their deaths, first Marie in 1938, then 3 years later, Joseph in 1941, were buried in a Milwaukee cemetery. Relatives' memories of Marie are of her devotion to raising her 8 living children and to her Catholic faith. In particular, she prayed to the Blessed Virgin Mary, while Joseph enjoyed telling and hearing French stories and playing a game called 30. Our last male Racette in this Ancestry research account was born in 1902 in Iron Mountain and went by the nickname Jean. Jean, a Sawyer from Iron Mountain, and Alice Mary Milligan, a normal school graduate and teacher from Foster City, met at a mutual friend's wedding. Despite his limited education, Jean's strong Catholic faith and work ethic won Alice's father's, Patrick Milligan's, acceptance of him as his daughter's suitor. While Jean's parents came from French Canadians, Alice's father, Patrick Milligan, was of Irish descent, and her mother, Mary Martella, of German descent. Her father worked as a woodsman's superintendent of logging operations in Dixon County, Michigan. On the horizon of this Foster City, Michigan farm country postcard, one can make out a band of trees. This is a picture of the Ford sawmill in Lawrence, Michigan, where Jean worked when meeting Alice, and would work for 41 years. It was in this mill where Jean was in an accident that hurt his back. The process involved in getting back pay developed Jean's involvement in and lifelong support of worker unions. It was fun to learn that Alice in her senior year at Escanaba High School was nicknamed Muggins, who was always the same quiet and kind person that I'd later come to know as my grandmother. A year later, after a year of normal school or teaching college, Alice had her own class at District Number 5 school. These pictures were found in a scrapbook that Alice made of her students and early married years. While these facts are fun, it's noteworthy that Alice was a teacher and her sister, Margaret, a registered nurse. But it's only now that I've really come to appreciate what progressive thinkers Alice's parents were. According to Google AI, during the 1920s, only 7% of all females in the U.S. earned college degrees. Given the rural setting of Alice's family, clearly her parents valued education, encouraging not only their sons, but also their daughters to work in higher skilled jobs. Although Alice would quit teaching to raise a family, her sister Margaret, who would have no children, made nursing a lifelong career. Jean's playful, confident and gregarious personality, won her heart. Alice's playful, calm, and kind words won Jean's. Later, their children would tease that Jean's car impressed Alice, too. The craft cutout, made in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was found in Jean's scrapbook. Also in her scrapbook was this newspaper description of her marriage to Jean. In short, it took place during a high mass on Monday in June 1926 at 8 o'clock in the morning at St. Joseph's Church in Foster City, Michigan. A wedding breakfast followed at Alice's parents' home for 25 guests. Alice and Jean then went by motor car for a visit to Milwaukee, after which they would return to their home in Lawrence, Michigan. Eugene and Alice made this house at 609 East Broad Street in Lawrence, Michigan, their lifelong home. The top left is the home that they bought from a carpenter and neighbor, Midos Robert, and his wife. According to Jean and Alice's daughter, Sandy, the couple remained good friends with their neighbors. As the family grew, Jean raised the roof and added a second floor to include a room for boys and another for girls, as well as one small bathroom with sink, toilet, and tub. The family's living room had a front door that opened onto the front porch. 4 years after their marriage, the 1930 U.S. federal census lists Eugene as a sawyer and Alice as a homemaker. The couple had one child, Mary Faith, who was 1 year old. All their lives, the Catholic Church in Lawrence remained a center. It's where their children were baptized, made their first communion and confirmation, and later married, and where Jean spent hours in service to the Knights of Columbus, and both Jean and Alice attended Sunday Mass. Through many years, Alice also enjoyed cats as pets. One cat she credited with saving her life. For one day, the cat woke her from a nap to go outside, which was an unusual behavior. As Alice opened the door, she fainted with her body inside but her head outside, which saved her life, for the house was filling with deadly carbon monoxide from their furnace. Jean and Alice's playful nature shows in this photo. Aunt Sandy thinks it was taken just after Alice shared with Jean that they were expecting their first child. Here's a picture of Alice, Jean, and their first child, Mary Faith. And here's a photo of the three I call the three amigos, from youngest or oldest to youngest: Mary Faith, Tom, and Sally. Alice and Jean enjoyed picnics. Here's a day they were at the power dam. Eugene took this photo of the family in 1943. Pat is yet to be born when this picture was taken. Here's the family behind the family house, and it was taken in 1951. The entire family is present. In Alice and Jean's hearts and home, there was always room for one more, whether it was making room for their widowed neighbor, Mrs. Schneider, at dinner time, or taking in high schooler Dee, whose parents had died. Dee became their 8th child in the family her entire life. While Alice was a devoted mother who was able to put together delicious, hearty meals on a shoestring budget, she was also an educated woman who was her husband's advisor and editor as well as an active community member. In the newspaper article, we learned that she served on the Lawrence Baraga Community Federal Credit Union Board of Directors. Memories of my grandmother include her cooking and serving dinner, then resting, reading, and saying a rosary in her bedroom while the children cleaned the dishes and kitchen, only to reappear in a fresh dress and heels, ready for whatever activity the afternoon would bring. Often when I was around, she would sit in her recliner to complete the vocabulary pages in the Reader's Digest and involve me in conversation with her, always stressing the importance of lifelong learning. Although a devoted husband and father, Gene was also an active community member. Even though he had hurt his back in an accident at the Ford sawmill and could not work for a while, he still volunteered as a Lawrence fireman, sheriff's deputy, and substitute Ojibwa chief, who sold Native American crafts from a teepee on the side of the road connecting Lawrence and Baraga. My brother, Tom Jr., recalls the chief laughing and saying that Gene looked more Indian than he did. Foremost, Gene was a particularly proud participant in the Knights of Columbus, a fraternal organization whose purpose is to provide volunteer opportunities in service to the Catholic Church, their communities, families, and young people. Gene rose to the level of fourth-degree Grand Knight. In the upper right, we see Gene serving up dessert at a church social. On the bottom right, in the 70s, he and other Lawrence leaders saw a need for affordable low-income housing for senior citizens. Gene and the leaders traveled to Washington, D.C. on January 26, 1976, they spoke in front of a congressional committee about the need for funding for such housing. The result of their work is today's Green Hill Manor in Lawrence. Gene would joke that he already knew which unit with a view he wanted. Although Gene lived in his and Alice's house until his death, his oldest daughter, Mary Faith, enjoyed a unit in the complex for several years until her passing. Alice and Gene enjoyed their path in life and continued to take adorable pictures. Alice passed away at the age of 70 in the Baraga Memorial Hospital in Lawrence in 1973. Although missing Alice terribly, Gene continued to keep busy with church and community service, as well as a few car trips to visit relatives. On December 10, 1978, he came home with a focus, affixing and returning a picture frame for the church, when his feet caught on a throw rug by the back door, causing him to fall down the basement stairs onto the cement floor. 2 days later, when Gene's church friend, Howard Chartier, grew concerned about Gene not returning with the fixed frame, something that was outside of Gene's character, he asked Gene's son-in-law, Herb Manning, and daughter Mary Faith to check on him. Sadly, Gene had already passed away. To honor Gene, his funeral was attended by KC Knights of Columbus members, firemen, sheriffs, and his many friends and family. Both Gene and Alice are buried together in the Lawrence Township Cemetery in Michigan. Gene and Alice's legacy lies in these individuals. Can you name them? How about putting them in order from oldest to youngest? How did you do? I wonder how Jean and Alice would have reacted to seeing their many descendants who united for the reunion in 2001. I've labeled who I could find. Can you identify others? Thank you for listening to my version of our Racette ancestral story, started by Jean and Jeanne Racette. Certainly, our Racette story includes more anecdotes and details, and thankfully, our branch carries on for more versions yet to be told.